Okay, so thank you again for watching my YouTube channel and for your interest in honeybees. In this case, we're talking about backyard honeybees and these frequently asked questions series. This is frequently asked question video number 3. This is geared towards beginning beekeepers, so if you're a beekeeping expert, this is probably going to bore you to tears. If you want to know what questions are going to be answered in this video, then please look down in the video description and I'll write in each question that we're going to talk about, and they're in order. So thank you for sending your questions in. If you posted them through the Facebook, Fred's Fine Fowl, or if you put them right in the comments section underneath the previous FAQ videos. And you can do that also on this video. Just go down in the comments and write down questions that you might have. You can look at the other two videos that we've done before this, and there's a playlist that I'm putting together. So chickens and honeybees. Thanks again. So we'll get right into it. The very first question we got was, bees in small yards for kids. In other words, how do you keep bees in your backyard if you live in a suburban neighborhood and you've got children of your own? Well, I think when it comes to beekeeping, you definitely want to pick a type of bee that's going to be very docile. But the other thing is, make sure to check out your local ordinances and also check in with your neighbors. If you're living in suburbia, you may have neighbors on either side and then somebody else directly behind you. And if that's the case, you want to touch base with those people and let them know that you plan to keep bees. Now let's say that everything's okay, that the regulations are in line and you can keep your bees and you want to keep a couple of hives. Then the next step is to make sure that you put them in a portion of your yard where kids aren't going to be running through and playing and there's not going to be a lot of activity. So you can quadrant off your beehives by setting up stockade fencing, for example. Some people do that around their trash cans and things like that, so it's no different than with the bees. You want to make sure and preserve access to your bees. So you have to think about moving hives in and out, equipment in and out, and the ability to remove honey and things like that. So leave space all the way around your beehives so that you can come and go with comfort without knocking into them. And also face the entrances of your hives towards your yard. Don't sit up on the perimeter of your yard and then put your landing boards facing your neighbor. Because what we want to do is control the way the bees come and go from the hives. So if there's a physical barrier like a stockade fence or a privacy fence or something like that, the bees are going to leave the hive and go up and over, and then their flight path will hopefully be well above other people's heads. Now, different times of the year, if your neighbors have flowering trees or if they've got plants and bushes that are good sources of nectar, those bees are going to be visiting their yard. So once again, touch base. If someone right next to you is allergic to bees or has a dangerous allergy, I would stop thinking about keeping bees. Now, here's another thing. If your backyard really is very small, some people are keeping their bees on rooftops and things like that, but you also might know someone who lives out in the country who would be happy to have you put a couple of beehives on their property. And that doesn't mean you put them out there and ignore them, but it would give you a place to park your bees where they're safe and well away from people. And you could go and visit and attend to those hives. And with the permission of that landowner, they would also possibly have access to superior forage, for example. So those are the basics. Check with neighbors, comply with ordinances, have a fencing that requires the bees to fly up and over so they're not zipping right through your neighbor's yard at eye level. And of course, beyond that, consider maybe even taking hives out of town and making friends with somebody who lives in the country. So the next one is landing board types and screens. Some people were asking questions about screened landing boards and what's the purpose. The most common landing board, I went outside and brought landing boards in for you. The most common landing board is this wooden landing board. It's pretty dirty. This one is grubby. This has been out and in use in my bee yard since 2008. So it has lots of propolis. You can see that even the bees have chewed this up and everything, but the solid bottom board, here's the underside, here's the side that is in the interior. Now back in 2008, I painted the bottom of the landing board. I don't recommend you do that, just leave it plain wood. You can tell that this is composed of several pieces of wood that are all glued together and framed up. You can build these yourself if you have some basic carpentry skills. But this is the most common landing board design that you're going to see. When the hive body is sitting on it, you're going to see that the landing board has a little extension here at the bottom board. The landing board is the part that sticks out the front of your hive, and the bees land on it and use that to get in and out of the colony of the hive there. So This is the most common, and what's the advantage of it? Well, it closes off wind and weather for sure, so it cuts down on drafts. The other thing is, if there's any honey or pollen bits and things like that that drip or fall onto the bottom of the board, the bees can come in there and they can clean it up. So everything is contained, and there's no draft here. So those are the benefits. It's a little bit insulating too. You can tell it's nice thick wood, thicker the better. And when you set your hive on it, your hive literally does just sit on the landing board. There's nothing that fastens it. I have swarm boxes where I've put landing boards on, and I've actually bracketed those to that box, but that's because I'm going to transport them. When these sit in your bee yard and your hive box sits on top of it, the bees are going to put propolis, as they have here. This is all propolis residue. They'll seal it on themselves, and then the weight of the hive holds its position. So this is the most common, solid board. They can recover losses here. That's pretty much it, and it's insulated, and it's solid, and it's the most common. So then, this is a landing board that comes with flow hives. This is the 7-frame flow hive, which goes to the 10-frame Langstroth. And when we say 8 and 10 frame flow hive, or 8 and 10 frame hives in general, we're talking about the number of frames that go into the box. It's not the number of boxes. Some people thought that when we were saying 8 and 10 frame that we were talking about 8 or 10 boxes high. So it's really the number of frames that are inside each box. So this is a 10 frame, so 10 frames would go in it. Now this has a slant on it, and that's because flow hives tilt back, and this landing board tilts the hive straight back so that you can extract honey through flow supers. But it's a screen bottom board, and this one has a front dam on it. So they've built up this segment here. I'm not a huge fan of that because the bees that die inside die behind this barrier here. So the bees that are cleaning up have to pick up the bee and haul it out. A flat, smooth landing board lets them drag everything straight out without having to clear a barrier. So the other thing is it has a corrosion-proof screen on the bottom. Now, what's the point of having a screen bottom? Well, in this case, on the back, you've got a couple of choices for where to put the corrugated insert that goes in here. Notice it's at the top one. So if you're trying to limit the air ventilation coming in through the bottom of the board, that's how you control it with these corrugated panels that you pull out. The other thing is, and you can tell this one has not been in a hive, but these panels are also used to catch varroa, for example. There's a second lower piece here, so it sticks in there and leaves a space. So on a screen board, you get additional ventilation through the bottom, but also if you have varroa in your area, or mites, or small hive beetles and things like that, when they get groomed off by the bees, it's going to fall through the screen and onto this board. And you can actually, there are mite count boards that have sticky surfaces on them, and there are materials that you can put on that to make it sticky, so that when the mites fall onto this, it stays there, and you can get a feel for the varroa that are in your colony. So it's part of an active control measure and a way to account for the mites. On a solid bottom board, mites that get groomed off by the bees that are not damaged by the bees can just crawl across the bottom board and go straight up the side and back into the brood areas again and onto your bees. So a screen bottom board helps your bees deal with mites and other problems like that. And then there's just the open screen bottom board. This is part of an 8 frame. This is the landing board section, and this is the part that would be enclosed in the hive. Now this thing is open and vented all the time. Again, now I've had this one probably for 11 years, and as you can see, I've never used it because during the summertime, I could see if you have a really, really hot spell that you might think that the added ventilation is going to help your bees through the bottom. Also, if your bees are grooming off varroa, for example, and they fall through this, they're going to fall through this and go all the way to the ground below. You have that option with the other screen bottoms that have that corrugated insert too, but this one, there is no option. It's open all the time. Now you may think that you'll put this in for the summertime and you'll have your bees have the use of that, the ventilation, and that varroa control that helps throw things out of the hive. But then what happens is winter can sneak up on you, and before you know it, you're in winter, and you're not going to want to pull apart your hive, and there you've got a bottom board with an open screen. And sometimes, if you have a lot of colonies out there, you may even forget which ones have screens and which ones are closed up. So my personal favorite bottom board is, of course, the solid bottom boards. And all the flow hives I have, some of them I've used traditional solid bottom boards instead of the ones that come with them. The Flow Hive 2 has an aluminum insert on the bottom board, and again, sometimes when you're drawing off honey, the honey may drip down into the bottom of your hive, and if there's a screen, the honey goes through the screen and onto the bottom board and out of reach of the bees, so they can't recover that and reuse the honey. And also, you know, like if you've watched your bees bringing in pollen, they go to scratch off the pollen and stick it in the cells. Field bees go directly to the cells and stick the pollen packs in there. If any of that falls to the bottom and there's a screen bottom board, again, they don't recover those resources. So there's good and bad for everything, but those are the differences. The solid bottom board with a screen, and some kind of pest management corrugated piece, like this again. These are all weather, but they do wear out, so you need spares. And you can use those for mite counts, and then of course screen boards that are just wide open, which some people, even in the north, use those. I don't have a good percentage on the survivability in winter with a completely open bottom, but just in my mind, an open bottom that is just open to the weather and these harsh winds and everything doesn't make a lot of sense in the north, but you're going to find people that use them and use them successfully. But those are the three types right there. And the other question I received was splits for expansion. In other words, you do splits, and how do you do them? Okay, now the disclaimer here on my YouTube channel is that I'm just sharing what I do. So if somebody does something different, especially when it gets into splits and things like that, everybody's got their own method. I have an observation hive, and if you've watched my video, and if you haven't watched it, go check it out, because I show you how I populate my observation hive. I just went and took brood frames from colonies that were strong, and I put them all together in that hive, and then I waited 3 days, and I installed a queen that I bought in, and then they took off from there, and they did great. So what I do is I like doing splits, first of all. And what is a split anyway? Let's go there. So a split is when you have a strong colony, and you're in a nectar flow, and everything's great, and you've got all these frames of brood where the baby bees are hatching out, and you've got a surplus of bees. So sometimes when I see a hive and it's really built up and I've stacked medium supers on and it's just wall-to-wall bees in there, it's a great opportunity to make a split, because a couple of things are going on. One, you have some great bees. They're doing really well in the environment that you're in, so why not use that stock to expand? The other thing is they're really strong, so pulling out brood is not going to hurt that colony. So all I do is bring a temporary hive stand right up next to the hive that I'm interested in. And I smoke them. I do this in the middle of the day. And the reason I do that in the middle of the day is because most of the foragers are out of the hive. The population is much reduced, so now I have access to everything. So I'm going to pull apart those boxes carefully after smoking them, and I'll put it down. Now recently I don't smoke them, I spray them with Honeybee Healthy. And when you're doing a split, Honeybee Healthy mixed with sugar water is a great way to knock down the pheromone and occupy the bees, because what they're going to be doing is licking up that sugar syrup. So I pull out 3 or 4 frames packed with brood carefully, because you want to look over those frames and make sure you don't pull the queen. Is it the end of the earth if I pull a brood frame out and put it in a new box and the queen went with them? When I have frames full of eggs and open brood are developing larvae that have not yet been capped, so they're not in the pupa state yet. So they can actually be turned into queens if there's a queen lost during this event. So I pull those frames out, occupy the new box with them, and then I take extra frames, because the brood frames have predominantly nurse bees on them. Now these are going into my own apiary, so they're only going 50 feet away, let's say. So if I'm pulling the bees on the brood frames out and putting them in my new box and shaking them off in there and then putting those brood frames back in the original box, I've increased the number of bees I have available to attend to the brood, but also those bees have never left the hive. And because they've never left the hive, they don't know where they live. So those bees, when I move them to a new colony that I'm establishing by making this split, stay with that new colony, and they act as nurse bees, and they mature, and then they become foragers themselves, but they only know the new location, so it's very simple to do that. Now then, once I've pulled out the choice brood frames that I want, you also want to make sure that you've got honey frames to go in there. So then I go a couple boxes up and I pull out honey frames too, and I put those in on the outsides of, so I'll push the brood frames to the middle, 3 or 4 full frames, shake the nurse bees off of other frames that I find, put a couple of frames of honey on the outside of that and push it all together. And even if you see some frames that are half pollen, for example, stick those in there too. That gives them immediate resources. So we push all that together, and I go right to an 8-frame box. Some people start with nuke boxes, or they have reduced boxes, and that's fine because it's a smaller area for the bees to manage and protect. I don't do that myself. I go straight to an 8-frame or a 10-frame deep box. And that's because I just let them build up, and then I don't have to move it again. So I'm not in the, in the habit of moving them a couple of times from smaller boxes to bigger boxes and so on. I start them right off in the 8 or a 10, and then I just let them expand. So once I've done all of that, I've watched for the queen. Now, you're way ahead if you find the queen and actually put a little cage on her. So if you put a cage on the queen and then she holds her position, now you're free to shake all the other bees off that you want. So then you're making sure to leave the queen with that original colony. Now, we've made a split, we've got those brood frames in there, and they're all going to start hatching out. There are a couple of choices then, all right? Now, in the absence of a queen, they're going to notice within a couple of days that the queen is completely gone, the pheromone is gone. And what they'll do is they'll use the open brood and they'll start to make their own queen. So that's a high-risk thing. Plus, you're going to wait a long time for that queen to lay. So you already have hatching brood, so you've basically made your own nuke. And what I do is I order in queens before I even do the evolution. So I order my queens in, and they're going to arrive in 3 days. That's when I do the split. 3 days after that, I introduce the queen in her cage, put her in that new colony that I took the split from, and then watch and see how they accept that queen. And once they do, then they'll get her out of that cage and have a laying queen immediately. So as these brood are hatching out in the new colony, then that new queen will begin to lay eggs. And so we're in business, and the cycle just continues. So it's a very easy way to expand your apiary if that's what you want to do. I personally don't have any interest in expanding my apiary. I only want to replace die-offs. My maximum number of hives that I want to manage is 10. So when I end up with a surplus and all my boxes are full, that's when I start looking for new beekeepers to give stock to. And I give them my lower performing colonies and replace them with top performing colonies. So that's how I do my splits. Next. Oh, and we talked about smokers in my last frequently asked questions video, and somebody asked, when you're finished with a smoker, how do you put it out? Well, usually you use up your smoker, but you can of course just open the smoker and shake it out somewhere, or I just set it on a cinder block or something and I let it just finish burning out on its own. By the time I'm done working with the bees, generally the smoker is almost empty anyway, but of course you can just dump it out somewhere. It is capable of starting a fire, so make sure not just dump it on dry grass or something right in your apiary. I recommend going somewhere where it's gravel and so on, and dump it out that way and treat it as you would any kind of outdoor fire. Make sure you put it out. But I just let mine burn out on their own. So I set it on a cinder block and let it go. Southern bees. Can southern bees handle cold climates? Okay. In the United States, there's a lot of very common bee types out there. We have Italians, Germans, Carniolans, Buckfast, Caucasian, and Russian bees. Super common. The bees that I'm using are from the bee weaver family in Texas, and they have been developing their own line of bees for more than 100 years. And those bees go without treatment, so I get those bees. Now they come from Texas. How do they survive winters in the Northeastern United States along the Great Lakes, which is where I reside? They do it just fine. So when people talk about southern bees that maybe can't handle the cold, for example, there are bee behaviors. Here's the problem. And this is really not a beginner question in some regards, because the bee genetics get very complicated. These lines of bees have been diluted and altered and selectively bred, and So they're trying to make bees that are adaptable everywhere. But if you look at commercial beekeepers that are providing pollination services and things like that, they might start off in Florida, they might end up in Northern California, sometimes they go northeast. So the bees that they're hauling around are handling a variety of weather conditions, but then they try to winter them in areas that are not freezing cold to where they will kill off a lot of their stock. It's not that they can't winter over. You can find southern bees, bring them to the north, and house them correctly and everything else, and they'll still make it through winter. The question is, how well do they make it through winter? Some of those bees that are from a southern climate may build up a lot of brood going into winter, and that's a disaster. Because if they have a lot of brood to take care of, they can use up all the resources, the brood's going to die anyway, and then the bees starve in place. So, and then within the same, because the reason I mentioned the bee weaver bees that I use is because I have one type of stock throughout my apiary. But they come out of winter vastly different from one another. Some of them are really strong in the spring and they're just going gangbusters. A few days ago we had a warm up and I had a hive, the whole front was just loaded with bees and they're just going nuts. And that was a very small colony, by the way. That was in just an 8-frame, single deep, and those are the strongest looking bees that I have right now. And others are just very slow and they stay clustered longer and they don't respond right away to warm weather. But those are the ones that in a couple of weeks, if you look at the beginning of this video, we showed that it's raining outside. So right now it's cold and wet and damp, and those bees are staying clustered and they're not doing anything. But they're the ones that will respond to the environment. For example, as soon as the pollen starts to build on the trees, those bees are going to be out foraging, and that's when they're going to start building their brood. So if they wait till natural pollen sources come in and then they start building brood, now we're delayed, 25 days. It takes 21 days to lay an egg and for that egg to hatch and be a viable bee. So we're forecasting. So those bees that respond immediately to that environment are cold hardy, but they're not going to build and have the workforce that some of the other bees, some of the Italian bees, for example, will have a huge workforce in the spring, but those are being fed generally. So the other end of it is how much care do you want to have to be giving to your bees for them to make it through winter? So it's not a simple question. I don't know of a line of bees, a type of bee in the United States right now that's being managed that cannot survive a winter in the lower 50s days. And when you get to Alaska, you're in a whole different category. So there are people in Alaska that lose all of their bees every winter and start fresh with new bees every spring. That's a whole different thing. So that environment doesn't support bees really. But where I live, all of my bees do really well in the spring. They take off. I expect by the end of this month, end of February, beginning of March, that all of my bees are going to be foraging and building up on their own. So it's not that southern bees don't do well or can't survive the north. It's just a matter of what traits they bring with them and what traits you desire in bees, because there's more than just surviving the winter. There's the disposition of the bees. Some of them are extremely gentle. Some of them are very aggressive and defensive and hot. And you really are going to have to find the bees that work best in your environment and work best with you. So I wish I could really give you a pat answer for that, but my stock is... can't believe there's a fly in here. Anyway, my stock is the weaver bees, and they're from Texas, they're from a hot climate, and they work here. Now here's the other thing, plastic or wood frames, plastic or wax foundation. I use everything. I have wooden frames, I have plastic frames. Let me show you an example. This is a wooden frame. Alright. Now, the only difference in Honeycomb, this is foundationless, so there's no wires through it. You look at this open space at the bottom, they're connected at the sides here, and they start at the top and they just build down. What I do is, if I have 2 full frames, I gradually rotate my frames out. So what I do is when I pull a frame that kind of looks bad, I'll put a brand new one in there, but I won't pull all of them at once. So every other frame is what I'll pull out, and then I'll put in like wooden frames and let the bees draw it out. I leave the most natural comb down in the brood frames. But predominantly I use Acorn plastic heavy dipped frames. So let me show you one of those. This is an Acorn Frame, and it has honey all over it. This is just a honey frame, and I like it for honey. Wax moth larvae can't chew through this, and they're solid. They last basically forever. But just like with other frames, you're going to swap them out. These are recyclable food grade plastic, so you can get rid of those. There's another company named Pureco that also makes these plastic frames, and I believe Man Lake is also making their own. Of those, I chose the Acorn frames because they were the most rigid. They don't flex in the middle. And I like the black ones because I like to do photography, and I like for there to be a strong contrast for the eggs and developing larvae and things like that. And the other thing is the Acorn frames came very heavy dipped in wax, and I noticed that my bees draw those out the fastest. So I use plastic, I use wood. I do not use plastic foundation. Some people do that, and I guess there's nothing wrong with it. It's food grade stuff, and the bees build off of that as long as it's waxed up nice. And I just don't, because why not just use an entire plastic frame that's ready to go and not do the wood with the plastic foundation in it? That just seems like a lot of extra work. I like to just drop the frame in and let it go. Now, if I were doing traditional honey extraction, I'm going to put it in a spinner. Those wooden frames without a foundation in them, I would not be able to spin that very well because they tend to, the whole thing flexes. My spinners are face out like this. And so the centrifugal force actually pulls out from the face of it. So if this were a foundationless frame of wax, that stuff just, the whole thing, I'm going to lose it. So you could do cut comb or something like that. But spinners that are along the long axis, so they rotate like that, your wax frames could probably do okay with that. So, and again, most of you know already that I've converted almost entirely to flow hive for honey extraction, so I don't do any more spinning and uncapping and things like that. So I do like the plastic frames, but there's nothing wrong with wood too, and the considerations are kind of aesthetics. Some people say that you need to use beeswax foundation. The commercially available beeswax foundation that a lot of people are getting, they're finding it's tainted with a lot of chemicals. So you're not necessarily improving the health and well-being of your bees by using industrial wax foundation. So that's pretty much it for the frames. So I use plastic and wood. Robbing protection. So that's a good question for this time of year because we're about to get into a warm-up. Spring is going to be on its way. And you want to make sure that some of your hives that might be struggling are, and this also gets into the type of bees that you're going to keep as well. You know, some bee lines are known for robbing and being aggressive towards other bee colonies. So it's another thing kind of to think about. But in the spring, when your bees start foraging and the resources are low, but their numbers are high because they're hatching out all those babies, they're going to be looking for resources. When they don't find them in the environment, they're going to start looking at other hives. When they do that, when they land on the landing board and their scouts are checking things out, if that landing board is poorly defended, they're going to just march in there and start taking it over. And when they find out those scouts can get in there and get out and they go back to their parent colony, they're going to come back, only now they're going to have 300 foraging bees with them. And then that number increases until there's a huge feeding frenzy. And that colony becomes incapable of being defended. So what you can do for that is, of course, put entrance reducers on the landing board of your beehive. And it's, you know, if you've ever seen the movie The 300, where they, 300 stood off thousands because of the hot gates, and there was a narrow passage that they had to come through. Same thing with honeybees. Fewer bees can defend a smaller opening. So if you've got a weak colony, now if push comes to shove, this is I just did a material review of Bee Smart Designs cover and things like that in their feeder, but they also have this robbing screen. So by putting a screen on the landing board at the entrance, you can stop a robbing frenzy. If you show up and it looks like there's a huge amount of activity going on, but the tell is when you look at that landing board and you see all this activity, is that robbing? One of the ways you can tell is there's lots of bits and pieces. It's like a robbery. They're just throwing stuff everywhere. There's detritus all over the landing board. So these are robbers. These aren't bees that are resident to that hive that are keeping it clean and orderly. The other thing is they're overwhelming any attempts at guarding it. So if you see bees coming and going with no guards on the landing board, there's a very good chance it's being robbed. So when you close that off with this or something like it, you can also just put an entry reducer in there and make sure that they have a very narrow entry to the hive that can be defended. Then these, you just open up these top wings, and now the resident bees come and go here. Robbing bees like to zoom straight in. They don't want to spend any time on the landing board because their goal is to get resources and get out, and they don't want to get inspected. They don't get taste tested on the landing board the way resident bees do. And they just want to get past the guards, rob, and get out. This prevents that direct access. The other thing is, if things are completely out of control, close it off completely. Someone else asked about if they're going to spray pesticide at a field near you or something like that. If you're fortunate enough to be told that there's going to be pesticide spraying, if there's agricultural activities near where you live, then you would want to, first of all, if you have any control at all or any influence at all over the farmer that's going to do that, request that they do it at night or early in the morning. Those are the least active times for bees. But if there's nothing you can do about it, which is likely because they're going to move when the time is right to spray pesticides and things like that, you can close up your colonies completely. You want to make sure they have plenty of ventilation. You want to prevent the foragers from going out. If you know it's going to happen the following day, when's the time to close up your colonies? At night. There will be foragers out that are going to be spending the night elsewhere. That happens all the time. But you're going to reduce the numbers of bees that are caught out in that spray by blocking up your hives. There are people that put screens around their hives and everything else. So you want to ventilate the hive, you just want to block them, and then as soon as it's clear and as soon as that pesticide is dry, then you can, of course, open and restore access to foragers and everything else again. Some of those foragers that are out and about, if they don't die from the pesticide, will come back to the colony. They still may die. Some of the hygienic bee lines, when they detect something is wrong with a returning forager, they kill it and eject it themselves. So the same things that can help you, the same equipment that can help you deal with robbing, can also help you if you're trying to restrict hive movements during periods where there's going to be pesticides and things like that in the environment. Screens, anything that you can do to block them up. But try to establish a rapport with your local farmers so that you know what's going to be sprayed when so that you can close things up. So pesticides, robbing protection, just restrict movements. If you've got an upper hive entrance too and your hive is being attacked, put a screen over that upper entrance also because you don't want them getting backdoored there. There's another question, when to inspect your hive? That's a really good question. Everybody's anxious to look at their hives, but and I know this probably is not the scope of the question, but a lot of people want to inspect their hives during winter. Please don't do that. Unless you're needing to put food on or something like that or provide some resources for the bees, there's no point in opening your hive in the wintertime when it's cold outside and you're just going to expose them and stress them a little more. If they're dead, you're going to find out when it's warm. So the next thing is, let's say it's a really warm day. Let's say the bees are going great. When's the best time of day to look at your hives? Well, I say most of your foragers are out around noon and early afternoon. Since those are the most active times for bees to be departing the hive, it's also the time when hive density will be at its lowest, so you can pull off the cover and inner cover. So I would say midday. That might be the hottest part of the day too, if I don't know where you live. But some of the advantages to midday hive inspections are just the position of the sun overhead, because what happens is the sunlight is going to pass right down through those frames. So you'll see more midday. If you do it in the early morning or if you do it in the late afternoon, you'll have a raking sunlight angle and you're not going to be able to see everything into the hive as well as you otherwise would. So by doing it midday and early afternoon, you reduce the number of bees that are in the hive so you can see a lot. Because sometimes you'll pull a frame of brood that you want to really look at and inspect closely, and it's so covered in bees that you're having to move bees out of the way just to see what's going on in there. So by doing it at a time when there are fewer bees in the colony, then you're going to have better access and be able to see things while you're dealing with fewer bees. If you're pulling frames of honey and things like that, the same rule applies, because you've got to get the bees off of the honeycomb so that you can pull it and do your extraction. So you again want to do that when most foragers are out and the numbers that you're going to contend with inside the hive are reduced. So noon to 2 or 3 in the afternoon would be optimum for that. The other thing is inspecting the hive. If you're pulling honey, you want to do that on hot days. So cold, cloudy, rainy days are not days to be inspecting your hive. Your bees are already going to be stressed. Most of the bees will not be out flying, although some will head out, but that's not a time. So a sunny, clear day without high winds and things like that would be a fantastic time for you to look at your bees. Conditions for extraction, pretty good follow-on to when to inspect your hive, because the same conditions that make for a good hive inspection are also a good time for you to be pulling frames if they're all capped and you're trying to extract the honey. Then the numbers of bees will be down and you can pull those frames. And you want to do that on a warm day. Extracting honey goes much quicker when it's a nice hot day. So same thing, number of bees is down, you'll be able to pull those frames, you'll be able to swap them and get them back out there. Now, the other thing is, if you're pulling frames for extraction, you're way ahead if you've already got drawn comb from previous extractions. So if you've got comb with you ready to restore to the hive that have been cleaned and stored, then when you pull those frames out, put that replacement comb straight in, and that way you're only visiting that hive one time. Some people pull whole boxes, and that's a whole different story. So you're going to pull the whole box. If you've got a replacement box to go on right then, put it on. The more you limit the number of times you open the hive, smoke the bees, and interact with the bees, the fewer visits you have like that, the better for the bees. So if you can do everything in one move, open, pull the frames you need, restore the frame resources because they still have to have a place to put their honey. If you can do all of that in one move, one visit, you're way ahead and it's much easier for the bees. Now that's all the questions. The last question that I received was oxalic acid treatment. Oxalic acid treatment for varroa mites is a very involved process. So what I've decided to do on that one is my next video is going to actually be how to treat for varroa. And as I mentioned before, I use survivor line bees, varroa resistant, hygienic bees. That doesn't mean that I'm not prepared to do oxalic acid treatment. I am. And I'm going to go over that and my thoughts about that in my next video. So thank you for watching this video. Thank you for submitting your questions. If you're interested in more videos from me, please subscribe. And if you liked this forum, if you like the way this is going, please click a like on this video and submit your questions down below. I'd be more than happy to answer them again. My kind of flow is going to be that whenever I get 10 or more questions ready to go, I'll try to do another frequently asked questions video. This is number 3. It's been well received. Thank you very much.